The morphine was supposed to knock me out cold. My brother thought it had. That's the only explanation I have for why he walked into my ICU room at 11:30 on a Tuesday night and said what he said, loud enough for me to hear every single syllable, while I lay there with my eyes closed and my hands folded across my stomach like a woman already rehearsing for her coffin. The cabin on Lake Hartwell is worth at least $400,000 now, he said. We move on it the second she can't stop us. His wife's voice came next, quieter but not quiet enough. What about the workshop? Your dad's tools are vintage. Some of those hand planes alone could pull $10,000–15,000 at auction. My father built that workshop with his bare hands. Over the summer of 1987, he poured the concrete slab himself. He hung every shelf. He taught me how to read the grain of a piece of wood before I knew how to ride a bike. Those tools were not antiques. They were the architecture of every Sunday afternoon I had ever spent feeling genuinely loved in this world. I did not move. I did not open my eyes. I kept my breathing slow, and even the way you do when every instinct is screaming and you still need the room to believe you're unconscious. My brother, my only brother, the person I had driven 4 hours to help move into his first apartment when he was 22, was standing 3 feet from my hospital bed, pricing out my inheritance while my abdomen was still draining from emergency surgery. And I was going to let him think he'd gotten away with it, for now. I need to back up, because none of this starts in that hospital room. It starts 6 weeks earlier at a client dinner in downtown Greenville, South Carolina. I'm a real estate attorney, have been for 16 years. I specialize in estate planning and property transfers, which, in retrospect, makes the whole situation either deeply ironic or perfectly fitting, depending on how you look at it. I know exactly what happens to assets when someone dies without airtight documentation. I've watched families I genuinely liked tear each other apart over a grandfather clock and a joint savings account. I thought that professional knowledge made me immune to it. I was wrong. I was wrapping up dinner with a longtime client at a restaurant on Main Street when the pain hit. Not a cramp, not indigestion, a white-hot spike below my right ribs that dropped me forward onto the table, hard enough to knock over a water glass. My client caught me before I hit the floor. The ER doctors initially thought it was a straightforward appendicitis. It was, technically, but the appendix had already perforated by the time they got me into imaging. What followed was sepsis, emergency surgery, and 3 days in the ICU that I have only fragmentary memory of: bright overhead lights, the particular smell of industrial disinfectant, and a night nurse named Cora who had cold hands and a steady voice. My brother arrived the second day. I hadn't seen Vincent in 14 months. He and his wife Roxanne lived in Asheville, barely 2 hours away, but there had always been some reason, some scheduling conflict, some prior commitment that made the distance feel much larger. He called on birthdays. He texted on holidays. He sent a card when our father died 18 months ago that read "Sorry for your loss," which struck me as a strange thing to write about your own father, but I told myself, grief takes strange shapes in people. He was at my bedside when I first came fully conscious after surgery. He held my hand and told me I'd given him the scare of his life. He said Roxanne was in the waiting room, that they'd dropped everything and driven straight down the moment they heard. He said family came first. I believed him. That's the part that still sits in my chest like something I can't quite digest. The night I overheard them talking about the cabin, I had been awake for almost an hour already. The morphine drip had been dialed back that afternoon at my request. I hated the cotton wool feeling, the way it slowed my thinking to a crawl. By 11 p.m., I was hurting but clear, lying in the blue-gray dark of the room with nothing to do but stare at the ceiling tiles. He didn't stay long, maybe 15 minutes. He and Roxanne spoke in the low, efficient tones of people finalizing a plan they'd already made. They talked about my father's savings bonds. They talked about the mineral rights attached to the lake property. Roxanne mentioned, twice, that the power of attorney my father had signed before he died had technically expired, which meant there was a window, she used that exact word, window, before I could update my own estate documents. They knew I was an attorney. They knew precisely how these things worked, which meant they also understood that a hospitalized woman on a pain drip, temporarily cut off from her files and her office, was about as legally vulnerable as I was ever going to be. They left without touching me, no hand on my arm, no adjustment of the blanket that had slipped off my feet. When the door clicked shut, I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then I pressed the nurse call button and asked for the phone number stored in my personal belongings bag. I needed to reach Dorothy. Dorothy Pruitt had worked in my family's home for 27 years. She started when I was 10, and my mother was still alive, back when my father needed someone to manage the house while he was putting 80 hours a week into his woodworking business. She had watched me do homework at the kitchen table every afternoon for 8 years. She drove me to urgent care once when I was 13 and opened my chin up on the driveway. When my mother died, she sat with my father in the kitchen at midnight because he couldn't sleep and didn't want to be alone, and she never made him feel like it was an imposition. After my father passed, I asked her to stay on to maintain the property while the estate was being settled. She was 63. Her social security wasn't going to stretch far enough, and she told me she'd rather stay busy than sit still. She answered on the second ring, despite it being nearly midnight. I didn't cry. I'm not someone who cries easily, especially when I'm angry, and right now I was operating at a level of cold, focused clarity that I recognized from the hardest cases I'd ever worked. The cases where someone had been genuinely wronged and the path forward was simply a matter of executing the right steps in the right order. I told her what I'd heard, every word. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in her flat North Carolina way, I figured something was off. Roxanne called last week asking whether your daddy's tool catalogs were insured separately from the main property policy. That was when I understood how long this had been in motion. I asked her to photograph every document that passed through that house. Every paper on the desk, every envelope, every note left on the counter. Could she do that? She said she'd already started. The next morning, I called my colleague Warren Cho, who had covered my caseload when I had knee surgery 3 years ago and who I trusted with anything. I told him I needed him at the hospital with a laptop and a notary by 9 a.m. He arrived with coffee and a legal pad and the expression of a man who had handled enough estate disputes to understand exactly what I was describing without needing me to spell it out. By 11 o'clock, I had signed a series of documents I had been meaning to update since my father's death but kept deferring, because estate attorneys are famously negligent about their own estate planning, and I was no exception. The irony was not subtle. I established an irrevocable trust. I named it the Frank Pembrook Legacy Trust. I transferred all real property, the lake cabin, the workshop and its contents, the mineral rights, the savings bonds, into it, and I named the primary beneficiaries as the Greenville County Habitat for Humanity chapter and a legal aid fund for families in the county who couldn't afford representation. I removed my brother's name from everything that had ever carried it. Warren didn't flinch once, he's seen worse. I was discharged 8 days after surgery. Vincent picked me up, because I had asked him to, and I sat in the passenger seat of his Land Rover, watching the highway markers pass and listening to him talk about the future, about how hard it must be to manage everything alone, about how he and Roxanne had been talking and genuinely felt they should be more involved in the family property going forward. For my sake, he said, so I wouldn't have to carry it all by myself. I nodded. I said that sounded reasonable. I said we should have a family dinner once I was feeling stronger, invite people, make it a real occasion. He agreed immediately. He suggested the following Saturday. He said Roxanne would handle the catering. I said that sounded perfect. What I did not mention was that Dorothy had photographed a printout sitting on the kitchen desk, an email Roxanne had sent to an estate auction house in Charlotte dated 5 days after my surgery, requesting a preliminary valuation on a collection of vintage woodworking tools at a Greenville County property. The email described the tools as belonging to a deceased owner with no living spouse. My father had been dead for 18 months. I was in the next room recovering from surgery. She had simply reclassified me. I also did not mention that Warren had filed the trust documents with the county clerk on a Tuesday morning, 3 full days before my discharge. By the time Vincent's Land Rover pulled into my driveway, every asset he was maneuvering toward was already locked behind a legal structure that his contingency fee attorney was going to spend years trying to crack and fail. The week before the dinner, I recovered quietly. I ate soup. I moved carefully. On the Friday afternoon before Saturday, I drove myself to Warren's office and picked up a sealed envelope. My incision pulled the whole way there and back. I didn't mind. Saturday evening, Vincent's car was in the driveway at 5. By 6, the house was full. A neighbor who had known my father for decades, a cousin from Charlotte, 2 friends of Roxanne's I had met exactly twice at family functions. The gathering had the careful, curated atmosphere of something designed to generate witnesses. Roxanne had placed a framed photograph of my father on the mantel above the fireplace. I noticed that. I had changed into the navy blazer I wear to important hearings. My posture was straight, even though standing for more than a few minutes still pulled at the healing tissue. Nobody commented on it. They were busy telling me how well I looked for someone who'd been so seriously ill. Vincent made a toast. He talked about family and legacy and how our father would have wanted his property in the hands of people who truly loved him. He used the word stewardship twice. He was good at this. He had always been good at the performance of sincerity. I waited until he sat down. Then I said, calmly, "Speaking of the estate, there's something I need to share with everyone." I reached into my blazer and placed two things on the dining room table. First, a printed copy of the email Roxanne had sent to the Charlotte auction house, with the date clearly visible in the header. I set it where the neighbor could read it without leaning far. Second, a stamped filed copy of the Frank Pembrook Legacy Trust documents. I placed it beside the email. The room dropped 10 degrees. I spoke without raising my voice. The trust was filed with the county clerk on October 14th. All property has been transferred. There is no auction to schedule, no window to move through, and nothing left that requires anyone else's management. Roxanne's face cycled through several expressions before settling into something blank and rigid. Vincent's face simply stopped moving. The neighbor picked up the trust document, read a paragraph, and set it back down slowly without saying a word. I looked at my brother. Dad poured that workshop slab the summer before I started 6th grade. He let me help him hang the pegboard for the chisels. I still know exactly where every tool belongs. You were at baseball camp that whole summer. You never once came out there with him. That was probably not the most precise legal language I could have used. But it was the most accurate thing I said all evening. Vincent tried briefly to reframe the situation. He said I was still recovering, that I was reading things wrong, that he had only ever been trying to look out for the family. Roxanne said nothing. She was staring at her email printout the way you look at something you should have deleted weeks ago. The cousin from Charlotte excused himself politely and never rejoined the conversation. Roxanne's two friends found their coats within 10 minutes. I asked my brother and his wife to leave, directly, without preamble. Roxanne picked up her bag. Vincent paused at the front door and said something about how I had always made everything harder than it needed to be. I told him the door was right there. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that follows a hard decision made correctly. Vincent's attorney sent one letter, probing for a weakness that didn't exist. Warren responded with 2 paragraphs. We never heard from them again. Dorothy retired at the end of the month. Within the parameters of the trust, I gave her what I legally could: a one-time gift, a strong reference letter for any future work she wanted, and the set of ceramic mixing bowls my mother had left behind that Dorothy had always admired without ever saying so. She told me she didn't need anything. She took the bowls and said goodbye at the front door the same way she'd said good morning 10,000 times, practical and warm and without any fuss. On a Sunday in November, I went out to the workshop alone for the first time since my father died. The light came through the south-facing window at the same low angle it always had in fall, laying a long pale stripe across the workbench. His hand planes were still hung on the pegboard in the sequence he'd drilled into me before I was 12. Roughing plane, jack plane, jointer, smoother, left to right, coarse to fine, the logic of it as clear as a sentence. I took down the jack plane, the one we had restored together when I was 16, the two of us spending a whole Saturday sanding the rust off the iron and oiling the rosewood tote until the wood was dark and smooth and warm in our palms. He had let me do most of the work. He said the only way to learn a tool was to fix one. I set it on the bench and stood there with my hand resting on it for a while. My father used to say that good work doesn't lie. You can see in any finished surface whether the maker was patient or in a hurry, whether they cared about it or just wanted it done. He said you could learn everything you needed to know about a person by looking closely at what they left behind. He was right about most things. I put the plane back in its place on the pegboard, went inside, and made a pot of coffee. Some things you protect not because of what they're worth, but because of what they mean, and those two things are never the same number. My father understood that distinction completely. He spent 30 years making sure I did too, and in the end, that turned out to be the only inheritance that actually held. Not the cabin, not the tools, not the mineral rights on 4 acres in Anderson County. Just the knowledge of what's worth keeping, and the spine to hold on to it when someone tries to take it from you.